Our key concept: cells are the basic unit of all life. We learned that when we talked in chapter 1. Some of vocabulary words that we have, we've got cell theory, cytoplasm, organelle, prokaryotic cell, and eukaryotic cell. Our main ideas: early studies led to the development of the cell theory. Prokaryotic cells lack a nucleus and most internal structures of eukaryotic cells. Our essential questions: what is the cell theory? And how are prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells different? All right, so way back when, there was this crazy theory called the theory of spontaneous generation. Now, in this theory, they actually believed that simple things like worms, frogs, maggots, mice, all came from mud, dust, and unpreserved food. They would like open up their cabinets and see mice in there, or go to cook some meat and they would find flies flying around it. And they actually believe like the flies came from the meat, or like the mice actually came from bread, all right? And many people, including scientists, believe this up until the 1800s. All right. And actually, when I was doing some research on this theory of spontaneous generation, I actually found a recipe for making rats. All right. This recipe said you get a bucket, like a big bucket, and you fill it part of the way with grain, like the bottom with grain. You put it outside your door for 5 days. Then you go check the bucket, and in 5 days, you would have rats. All right. We know that the rats did not come from the grain, but people actually believed that these simple types of organisms came from non-living sources. So this was called the theory of spontaneous generation. As new evidence has come out, we actually know now, no, this does not happen. Now, Francisco Redi was a scientist that did this experiment to disprove this theory in large organisms, all right? But this was not disproved on little until later on. Now, there was this really crazy experiment that Francisco Redi did to disprove this theory in large organisms. What he did was he actually took this piece of raw meat, and you can see it in these pictures here. He would expose it to air, and he would wait, and he would notice that there were maggots on it, all right? And then he would realize, those maggots all of a sudden would disappear, and then he would have a bunch of flies. Well, he decided he was going to test this and say, I don't think that the flies are actually coming from the meat. I think they're actually coming from these maggots. But he wanted to figure this out for sure. So what he did is he then took a piece of meat, he covered it with this thing called cheesecloth. And cheesecloth is kind of like a mesh. It's kind of like a screen. It's got these little holes in it. Okay, so he wrapped it up really good and tight with this cheesecloth. He waited a few days. He removed it. He did notice maggots on it. And then again, he had flies. All right. So he's like, I really think the maggots and the flies are connected. So then he did another experiment. He took that meat, he covered it with paper, and he wrapped it really tight. Okay. After a few days, he noticed he didn't have any maggots on it. All right. And lo and behold, no flies either. So he realized that the maggots were actually the source of the flies and not the meat itself. So this is how he disproved it, and he did some other things also to disprove this in large organisms. And then again, Louis Pasteur did this in 1859, and he did this for microscopic organisms. That's why I say some people believe this until the mid-1800s. But again, as we get new evidence, theories always change, and they change based on that evidence. All right, so here we are. All living things are made of cells. You know that. And scientists study cells to understand life. Now, most cells are too small to be seen by your naked eye. You can't look and just see cells all around you. You can't look at your skin and see cells. So in order to actually visualize cells and discover cells, we had to have something invented first, and that was the microscope. So the invention of the light microscope led to the discovery of cells and a better understanding of living organisms. The cell theory grew out of the work of many scientists and improvements in the microscope. So there were many scientists that contributed to this thing called the cell theory. And more was learned about cells as microscopes improved. And we have the cell theory, which is a unifying concept of biology, and you are going to have to memorize the parts of the cell theory. So you can see all these pictures right here. These are all the scientists that actually helped to contribute to the cell theory. So here we are with the scientists. In 1665, we have this gentleman by the name of Robert Hooke. And Robert Hooke made his own microscope, and he used it to look at a thin slice of cork. Now, cork is like a little piece of wood. You see cork like on the bottoms of women's shoes sometimes, like the heels or the sole parts. Also, wine bottles have that piece of cork at the top. It's a different type of wood. And what he did is he put a thin slice, and he put it under the microscope. And he saw these little tiny boxes, and they were all the same, but they were empty, all these little boxes. And he called them cells. Now, the reason he called them cells is actually back in his day in 1600s, if you were pretty rich, you were sent to the monastery to study. And a monastery is like where priests and things go, okay? People that were involved in the church, okay? But this is where all the learning happened. They had all the books and they had everything at that time. And so if you were part of a wealthy family, you went to the monastery and you did some learning there. Now, when you stayed at the monastery, you stayed in these little tiny rooms. In these rooms, they had like a desk and a bed and not much else, okay? So when he saw these little box-like things that were very empty, he called them cells because the rooms that they stayed in were actually called cells. And you can kind of think of it like a little jail cell. There's not much in there. There's a bed, a toilet, and that's about it. You know, maybe a desk, but that's it. Okay, same thing at the monastery. So he lived in a little thing, a little box called a cell. So that's why he called them cells. And we still obviously use that term today. So he is credited with discovering cells. Please remember his name, Robert Hooke. Just Hooke is fine. He looked at a slice of cork and he discovered cells. My next one, 1675, Anton von Leeuwenhoek. Now, Leeuwenhoek also invented his own microscope. He used a more powerful type of microscope to discover unicellular organisms living in pond water. And he actually could hold this little microscope on his hand and look down from one lens to the other. He put a little drop of water down here. And when he did that, he could actually see these little things swimming around in the water. And those were little unicellular or single-celled organisms. My next guys, I have in 1838, Matthias Schleiden. Schleiden concluded that cells made up every single part of a plant. And then we have 1839, right around the same time, Theodor Schwann discovered that all animals were made of cells. And then lastly, we have this guy in 1858, Rudolf Virchow, and he proposed that cells only come from the division of existing cells. Now, I can remember Schwann pretty easily because Schwann kind of sounds like swan, and swans are animals. So I can remember Theodor Schwann discovered animals were also made of cells. If I can remember that, I can say, oh, the other guy with the last name S said plants were also made of cells. And that just leaves him with the third part where Rudolf Virchow proposed that cells only come from the division of its existing cells. All right, so the gentlemen that were on the last slide, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow, all helped form this thing called the cell theory. And we have three parts to the cell theory. We have all living things are made up of one or more cells. Cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things or in organisms. And all cells come from existing cells. Please, please memorize these. Now, when you read about these, like on your EOC or your midterm exam, they won't always be exactly the same. They might say living things are made of cells. They might say cells are the basic units of life. And they may say all cells come from the division of existing cells. But they're going to have these general statements, and they're going to be very, very similar to these. So please memorize them. Now, when we talk about cells, there's two types of cells. We have prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Sometimes you can call them eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells. Same thing, so prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And now they're different, but because they are still cells, they share some common structural features. So no matter what kind of cell, you have to have certain things. And all of our cells, no matter what they are, have a cell membrane, the stuff called cytoplasm, these things called ribosomes, and DNA. And all the parts of a cell are called organelles, and organelle just means little organs. So they all have, again, a cell membrane, cytoplasm, ribosome, and DNA. It doesn't matter what kind of cell it is. Is it a berry cell, is it a bunny cell, is it a bug? It's going to have the same things, okay? Now, the difference is the eukaryotic cells are going to have more organelles, all right? But our prokaryotes are going to have less, and we're going to talk about that. But again, all cells, no matter what kind of cell it is, has a cell membrane, cytoplasm, ribosomes, and DNA. So here we are in prokaryotes, so prokaryotic cells. Now, prokaryotic cells are much more simple looking, okay? They have a lot less organelles. Now, prokaryotes lack a nucleus. They don't have a nucleus, and they don't have as many internal structures as those eukaryotic cells. Now, like I said, it's still a cell. It still has a cell membrane. It still has ribosomes. It still has a cell membrane, cytoplasm, all of these things, but it does not have a nucleus. It does have DNA, but its DNA is circular. It's just one single loop of DNA. It's all connected. It does not have membrane-bound organelles. What a membrane is just like a covering to the surface of something. You can think about it kind of like a Ziploc bag to separate something from other things. So basically, these little parts in other types of cells are wrapped in like a membrane, okay? So think of it like a membrane, like a Ziploc bag. So our ribosomes in a prokaryote share the same cytoplasm with the DNA. They're just floating freely. An example of prokaryotic cells are bacteria. So just run through these again with you. Prokaryotes, very simple looking. It's also very small, very, 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 very tiny cell. It does not have a nucleus. It has one single loop of DNA, no membrane-bound organelles, and our example is bacteria. Then we have eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are much more complex. They have a lot of organelles compared to the prokaryotic cell. They actually do have a nucleus, right? You see it. The DNA is inside the nucleus of the cell. It has DNA, it's rod-shaped, and we do have these membrane-bound organelles, okay? So that means that our organelles are all in their own little baggies. They're not just floating freely in the cytoplasm. Our eukaryotes are much larger than a prokaryotic cell, and they carry out much more specialized functions. So they have special jobs that they do. And most multicellular organisms, such as plants and animals, are eukaryotes. So we have plants, animals, fungus, and these other things called protists. Those are all examples of eukaryotes. So again, just to run through these, eukaryotes are much more complex looking. They have a nucleus. They have rod-shaped DNA, membrane-bound organelles, and our examples are plants and animals, fungus and protists, and then also we are animals, so we have eukaryotic cells. So just to summarize this, please go through, tell me what are the parts of the cell theory, so what is the cell theory, and then how are prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells different? If you have any questions, please let me know. You will have some assignments based on these things. And then again, I will just see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.